and other journals. Please help me welcome Dr. Gerald Roche.
Hi, everyone. I'm hoping that you can all hear me okay. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here today, to be able to speak with you all. I'm looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have. I'm going to share some of my thoughts about language oppression, basically giving a definition of what language oppression is, and contrasting it with other approaches that you might have already heard about today or that you might be familiar with. So I'm going to try and share my screen. See if that works. Okay. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen and everyone can hear me. If anything is, there are any problems, please interrupt and let me know. So I'm going to speak for about half an hour, and hopefully that will give us plenty of time to have a discussion afterwards. I want to begin with something we call in Australia an acknowledgement of country. So just for some context, the country of Australia was founded by European colonization that overtook and took control of many different indigenous countries over this continent. And so often when we begin an event speaking as an Australian, we acknowledge what those countries were in order to recognize the history of colonialism and the unfinished business of decolonization that is ongoing in Australia. So I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, who are one of the members of the broader Kulin Federation. And I want to recognize that the city of Melbourne, where I live, is the site of ongoing struggles for language reclamation and revitalization for the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung language and the Bunurong language. I also want to acknowledge that the university that I work at, which is called La Trobe University, is named after a historical figure called Charles La Trobe. And Charles La Trobe was the chief governing official for the British at the time of invasion here, that who oversaw the dispossession of Aboriginal people from their lands. He oversaw the massacres and the genocides that enabled Europeans to invade this land. So there's an important and ongoing conversation about whether it's appropriate to have institutions named after people like Charles La Trobe. I'm personally of the opinion that we shouldn't have institutions named after figures who oversaw colonization and dispossession and genocide. So we're entering a period of truth-telling and treaty here in the state of Victoria, which is where Melbourne is. So we have an ongoing truth commission where Indigenous led organization is aiming to document the truths of colonization and its impacts, including the impacts on Indigenous languages here. And this process is ending now, and we're moving into a period of treaty negotiations between Aboriginal peoples and the state. And I think as a part of those treaty negotiations, we should be seriously reconsidering the appropriateness of naming public institutions after colonial officials. So I'll just that's my initial remarks on that topic as a sort of preface to what I'm going to say, the kind of things I'm going to talk about. So, okay, broadly, the problem that my research deals with, the problem that I'm interested in, is the global decline of linguistic diversity. This has been a significant topic of research, particularly since the late 1980s, when we started to see internationally, major linguistics institutions take this up as a problem for research and advocacy. And since that time, we have many different estimates of how many languages around the world are endangered. The estimate that I find to be the most helpful and reliable, though I also think it's probably a conservative estimate, is the estimate from the Endangered Languages Project with their catalogue of endangered languages, which is a good uh, open access systematic resource that provides freely accessible information on all the world's endangered languages. And they estimate that just under half, I think it's around 46% of the world's languages, are currently endangered. And so that means that the intergenerational transmission of those languages is collapsing, that they are losing membership in the language community, and if that trend continues unabated, that those languages will no longer be in use anymore. And what that statistic suggests is that we are headed for a world of much reduced linguistic diversity. And so I'm interested in thinking about that as a global political problem. However, at the same time, it's also a very local problem because it exists in specific ways in specific communities. It's not a problem that affects everyone equally. So, for example, for the majority of Australians, are monolingual in English and they don't think about this problem and it really doesn't impact their life in any way. The people who are impacted by this tend to be, in the global scheme of things, relatively vulnerable groups. So they're indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, and so on, other groups like this. So even though it's a global problem, it doesn't impact everyone equally, and people tend to be concerned about it and think about it and affected by it relative to their privilege. So the other local dimension of it is the way in which local communities around the world are working to maintain and revitalize their languages. So the impacted communities are often struggling to resist the loss of their language. And sometimes that struggle to resist language loss can take the form of an explicit public protest movement, people marching in the streets, holding signs and things like this. But more often than not, that resistance takes the form of kind of an everyday political struggle that is woven into the fabric of people's regular lives, right? So that work to maintain and revitalize languages is supported by a range of different experts. Some of them work in universities, some of them work in civil society organizations, some of them work in governments. Those experts come from a wide range of disciplines. There are linguists, there are anthropologists, sociologists, applied linguists, political theorists, political philosophers, and so on. And it takes a wide range of perspectives to think about this issue and to address it at the global and local levels. And that's the broad context within which I situate my work. So I'm just going to talk about like two common approaches to the problem of language endangerment before outlining my own approach. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is from linguistic anthropology. So linguistic anthropology, over the last couple of decades, the research around this problem of global language loss and language endangerment has primarily been based on ethnographic research. And so ethnographic research means you go somewhere, you live with the community, you learn the language, you participate in everyday life, and you kind of hang out. But you hang out in a systematic way, you gather data while you're hanging out with people, but it's a highly qualitative research method through the lived experience of the researcher themselves participating in what people do from day to day. And in anthropological research on this problem of language loss, one of the key concepts that has been used to um, help understand what is happening is language ideology. So, language ideology is basically, we can basically summarize it as um, what are the things that people in that community believe about languages. So, that might include, for example, their understanding of what language is, how language works, what its relationship is to identity, how languages change over time, what causes a language to become endangered, and what they can do to intervene in that situation. So, people have lots of beliefs about languages, and they are often not aware of what those beliefs are, and they often don't express those beliefs explicitly. So the anthropologist has to learn about those language ideologies just by kind of hanging around, watching people, listening to what they say, and observing how they react to different situations. One of the key problems that anthropologists have explored through the use of ethnographic research and theories of language ideology is what has come to be known as the revitalization paradox. So, the revitalization paradox is the idea that if you go into communities where people are using endangered languages and you ask them why, how do you feel about this, what do you want to do about it, etc., very often large sectors of the community will say, we are worried about this, we want to do something about it. However, when you observe the behavior that people engage in, they either aren't consistently acting in line with those desires, or they are engaging in activities that actively work against those aims and goals that they have stated. So anthropologists trace the roots of this language revitalization paradox to language ideologies that people hold. Essentially, that people have unhelpful beliefs and understandings about language that lead them to engage in contradictory behaviors which do not support the maintenance and revitalization of the language. So this has kind of been one of the key contributions of linguistic anthropology to this field. And the other thing that I would note about this is that, in particular, it's been dominated by North American linguistic anthropologists. That this idea of language ideology and its application to the problem of language endangerment and language loss is really dominated primarily by a handful of anthropologists from the United States of America, and I'm happy to talk about who those are if you're curious later on. This also means that it tends to be dominated by case studies from North America. And although there are a few case studies from Asia and elsewhere, it's primarily North American case studies and North American theorists that we meet in this approach. Okay, so a second way of approaching this issue comes out of not necessarily only sociolinguists. It's also a set of tools which is widely adopted by applied linguists and regular linguists, I guess. And this is the idea of language vitality. So the concept of language vitality actually emerged in the Australian context of studying migrant languages way back in the late 1970s, but it has since been formalized into a kind of a standard approach, which is promoted by by UNESCO and United Nations more broadly, and they have this what they call a 9-factor model, where it's been updated. Anyway, they have a standard model of language vitality that they use. So in terms of research, as this approach, focusing on language vitality, does not rely so heavily on ethnographic methods. You don't need to go to a place, spend huge amounts of time learning languages and understanding culture and hanging around in this approach. Language vitality research tends to use more standardized, formulaic research methods and protocols like rubrics and surveys to gather data on the community and their language. So you can get a sense of what these kind of rubrics look like from the right-hand side. So they would ask questions about, if we start in the top left-hand corner, what is the number of speakers? What is the rate of intergenerational transmission? What is the community members' attitudes, right? And so rather than going in and observing these things, researchers working in this tradition would often simply go in and ask, like, are you positive about the language? Are you negative about it? Etc. And so we have a bunch of other criteria that people will use to assess the vitality of the language. And so this gets to the key, which is different from language ideology. Language ideology is essentially like a property of people's minds. It's how people think about language. Language vitality is a property of the language itself, essentially. And it looks at how strong a language is, right? Whether it has all the resources, the institutions, the policies that it needs to exist sustainably. And the key problem that has been investigated in this tradition is the idea of reversing language shift, which comes from the late American scholar Joshua Fishman. And he proposed this model of reversing language shift by reclaiming domains. So I'll just explain what that means. So a domain is kind of like a unique context in which a language can be used. We might think about education, media, healthcare, business, entertainment, etc., as distinct domains. And this idea of promoting language vitality is that the language essentially needs to be put back into those domains if it's no longer in them, and that once a language is fully used across all the domains, that will support its vitality. We also have here on the bottom left-hand corner, you can see there's this category of response to new domains, so that as new domains like technology appear, the language needs to go into those domains and sort of fill up the gaps, and that will give it vitality. And all of the other things like the materials for the language, the quality of documentation, institutional policies, etc., the attitudes, all of those support the language to be used in those domains. And the idea is that a language that is fully used across domains will be safe and will be transmitted across generations. So this is the language vitality approach from sociolinguistics, applied linguistics, and sort of more mainstream linguistics. And now I'm going to contrast those two approaches with the way that I think about these issues through the concept of language oppression. I'll talk a little bit about that. So language oppression, it's an idea that I've been developing or working on over the course of a number of years. It's not my idea. I didn't come up with the concept. I'll introduce where it comes from in a minute. But I've done my most fully developed work on the concept in my book, which is going to be published next week. Next week, next Friday, exactly. So exactly a week from now, I'll be doing the launch of this book. And so that's where I do my most sort of complete unpacking of the concept of language oppression. But I have a number of other online publications. Most of them are open access, and so anyone can read them. I'll give you a reference for one of them, but later in this slide. But basically, so the idea of, my critique of those two approaches, like I have different critiques of both of them, but on the whole, I would say that they fail to provide a full political account of language shift, of what's going on. And by a full political account, I mean an account that will link broad structural factors like colonialism, racism, capitalism, nationalism, etc., broad power structures, to individual and community behaviors. And I think that understanding that link between the extremely large macro scale and the micro scale of individuals, families, and communities, tying those two together is extremely important. So if I was thinking about, for example, the language ideologies approach, it tends to stay stuck at the level of the community, right? It thinks about what is the language ideology in this community and how can that ideology be transformed, but it doesn't attend enough to the broader political historical context that that community is in. Sociolinguistics approach of language vitality sort of does the other. It looks at the broader context, particularly those domains of language that exist more widely in society, but it doesn't really drill down to the individual and community level. So, for example, it doesn't explain how you get the language into the domains. It doesn't explain why the language already isn't in domains, etc. So in both of those approaches, in failing to link the kind of large scale and small scale of language shift, what happens is that they fail to provide us with a meaningful path forward to transformative political change that would enable the language to continue. And I'm happy to discuss further what I mean by that, but hopefully also some of the rest of the discussion will illustrate what I mean by that. So yeah, so after using both of those approaches in my work and then eventually finding them unsatisfactory, I was looking for another way of thinking about this problem. And I came across this extremely thoughtful and thought-provoking essay by Alice Taff and her colleagues, which is on Indigenous language use impact wellness. And they start off right from the beginning saying that the problem that we intend to examine is language oppression, not language endangerment, not language vitality, not language shift, but language oppression. And they define language oppression as the enforcement of language loss by physical, mental, social, and spiritual coercion. And when I came across that term, it was like a little light bulb went off in my head and it made a sort of immediate intuitive sense to me, and I've been working with that idea ever since. So I think one of the things that the idea of language oppression does is that it enables us to compare language oppression to other forms of oppression, right? Racial oppression, gender oppression, and so on, right? And that enables us to link conversations about language to other structures of domination. Then we can start pulling in theories and concepts and case studies and methods from other areas that have spent much longer developing those tools and bring them into the study of language. And that's kind of what I tried to do in my book and in some of my theoretical work. So specifically, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but I'm happy to answer questions. Like specifically what my work did in particular in the book was to develop some of the theories of the philosopher Michel Foucault and apply them to the problem of language oppression. And the key aim in there was to link broad scale forces to individual and collective behaviors. And I think the key problem that any adequate theory of language oppression has to understand is why and how people come to participate in their own oppression. Because this is necessary in the case of language endangerment. Language has become endangered through a process of collapsing intergenerational transmission. That requires essentially parents to withhold a language from their children, or it requires children to refuse to learn the language of the parents. In either case, there is an intergenerational manifestation of broader oppressive relationships in society. So we normally think of oppressive relationships as being sort of distant and distinct, where a dominant group enforces something through violence upon a oppressed population. Foucault's work gives us a sort of a complex series of theoretical tools for thinking about how oppression is much more subtle, much more integrated into everyday life, and requires the participation of people in their own oppression. So one of the articles where I talk about this a little bit is this article in the journal Patterns of Prejudice, and also furthermore in the book. But the thing to take away there is basically what I've done is to solve that problem of linking the broad scale structural to the individual and communal level, is that I've taken theories from political philosophy, and particularly the work of Michel Foucault, and I can talk a little bit about which ideas I think are helpful later on if you want to know more. Okay, so the reason why I think thinking about language oppression is important is because it provides a new set of pathways forward to maintain and revitalize Indigenous languages that are different from the practical methods that are suggested by linguistic anthropology and sociolinguistics, and the focus on language ideology and language vitality. When we start thinking about language oppression as being about the interplay of political forces, that enables us to think about different types of actions that we can engage in that are primarily political actions, which enable us to maintain and revitalize endangered languages. So just this morning, I got the proof copy for this article, which will be published shortly, hopefully in the next week or two. But this is an article where I'm developing some of these ideas. I'll get to that in a second. The main point that I want to start out is that even though we're talking about languages, linguistics as a discipline does not necessarily supply us with the tools that we need to intervene successfully in this situation. Expertise from linguistics is relevant and necessary, but not sufficient to solve the problems that we are facing. Linguistics and linguists have to cooperate with other people with different forms of knowledge to adequately solve these problems. So I'm just going to briefly mention like two bodies of knowledge and applied practice that I think are very useful for thinking about problems of language maintenance and revitalization. So one is the idea of language rights. So language rights draws on the broader human rights tradition in thinking about language as something that people are inherently entitled to, that they are able to make claims on, and which someone, usually the state, the government, is obliged to deliver something to them, right? So thinking about language in relation to rights enables us to compare language maintenance and language revitalization efforts to other rights-based campaigns, right? So rights around fundamental rights like civic and political rights, rights around gender, sexuality, and so on. There's a whole broad range of human rights campaigns and concepts that the language maintenance and revitalization movements can draw on. But then secondly, on a broader theoretical level, I think that we can also turn to social movement theory, which is like a branch of political theory or political science, depending on how you think about the problem. And social movement theory is the study of how social change is created and sustained by sustained collective action, so protest movements essentially. And there is a really 75 years of research in this area that we can turn to that helps us understand how social change is created by collective action. And there are loads of debates in this area that can inform our thinking about how to successfully maintain languages. Like, how do you get people to participate? How do you how do you successfully put pressure on people in power to create the changes that you need when you have less power than them? What kind of tactics and strategies have other movements used? What kind of risks do activists encounter, and how do they deal with them? How do different activist movements work together in order to pursue their goals? how do they use storytelling and language more broadly to convince people to understand these problems and to participate in the movement? So I think turning to social movement theory with with a politically informed understanding of language oppression, I think that is kind of key to successfully pursuing the maintenance and revitalization of endangered languages everywhere. So I will stop there and let's chat.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roche. Following that insightful lecture, we now open the floor for an interactive discussion. So, to guide us through this open forum, we are pleased to have Jomar Fortes as our moderator. Mr. Fortes is a dedicated second-year Master of Arts in Applied Linguistics student and will lead this engaging session. Mr. Jomar?
Maayong buntag kaninyong tanan. Good morning to everyone. Before we continue, I must say that Dr. Gerald Roche's presentation was truly illuminating. You know, his words really resonated with me, and I'm sure many of us feel the same, right? You know, it is undeniable that this issue deserves our full attention, and I couldn't agree more with your call for collective action and awareness. Now, consider the reality. Many of these languages, which have existed for centuries, are disappearing at an alarming rate. Speakers silenced not by choice, but by systemic forces. This is the sobering fact of language oppression, a force that manipulates power dynamics and reshapes the way we communicate. Today, we are fortunate to have with us Dr. Roche, whose work shines a light on these critical issues and sparking conversation about language ideology, vitality, and the very real consequences of linguistic hegemony. Let us take this opportunity to understand the relationship between language and power, investigate how power influences the words we use, and challenge ourselves to consider how we as a global community can advocate for the preservation of linguistic diversity. This time, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to join the conversation. Let's make this an engaging and meaningful dialogue. You can now ask questions by typing them in the comment section or just by clicking the raise hand button. Or you're welcome to ask your question to Doc Roche aloud. Just unmute yourself when you're ready, okay? Okay. Yes, Mr. Delepan, I appreciate you raising your hand. Please go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you. So, to Dr. Roach, you've mentioned earlier that a language that fills all domains are safe, such as English, which is primarily used in many domains. So, do you think, in relation to standardizing indigenous language, could help those indigenous language fill I feel in the gaps in those domains? Is it possible, sir, that standardizing them could, for example, in technology, could empower those indigenous language, could fill those gaps, and therefore stop oppression on those behalves?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. So, yeah, I'm kind of reluctant to take strong stances on issues like language standardization and domains and so on, because I think that a lot of those are context dependent. It really depends on the local situation, culturally, socially, and politically, in terms of what is going to work in that particular situation. The way that I would think about this problem would be to think about, in that context, if people want to engage in the standardization of their language, can they do that? Right? Is it legal for them to do that? Are they supported to do that with resources from the government, etc.? Can they organize that independently, or do they have to go through particular government channels in order to do that, etc.? So, like, I think that like the way that I approach this issue is that I'm not going to give anyone answers about what should and shouldn't be done. I think that those have to be negotiated by communities themselves according to their detailed understanding of local contexts. So I instead of answering your question, I would raise a series of other questions instead. That's the way that I look at these things. So it's not so much about whether standardization is going to work or not, but can people do the standardization? Are they going to be supported to do it? Is there support from the community, from the government? Is there going to be resistance from other communities and so on? So one of the topics that I research is the way that mainstream communities respond negatively to the revitalization of minority and indigenous languages. That's an example of the political dimension of these issues. So we can think about, for example, if people set about standardizing their language, what will the mainstream community reaction be? Will they be supported, or will they be attacked for doing that? In almost every situation that I'm familiar with, any activism or activity in support of a minority or indigenous languages will be attacked by the majority. Right? So those are the kind of issues that I would draw attention to rather than the standardization itself. So I know that I didn't answer your question, but I hope the answer is helpful anyway.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Roche. And now I also acknowledge you raise your hand, Mr. Hinkle. Go ahead with your question. Just unmute yourself when speaking. Go ahead, sir.
Excuse me. So my question is, in this age, globalization is obviously prominent, bringing with it the spread of the English language around the world. So my question is, in what ways does this impact the dynamics of language oppression, particularly for indigenous languages?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So, I guess that I'm a little bit critical of the way that globalization is spoken about as a threat to indigenous and minority languages. Like, globalization is often seen as this like dark cloud that hangs over everything, sort of blocking out the sun. It's this weird, mysterious force that does something, but we don't know who is doing it, why it's happening, how it happens. I would always encourage people to sort of dig down deeply into the specific processes that constitute globalization and the specific actors who are doing the things that are globalization. So when we think about, for example, the global spread of English, I think we have to look at least two different things which kind of get covered up by globalization. So the first thing is the historical legacies of colonialism, right? So my ancestors are Irish before we came to Australia. My family was in Ireland. We spoke Irish. We were colonized by the British. The British then drove my ancestors out of Ireland into Australia, where my ancestors then colonized the lands of indigenous people and forced the English language onto them. And this is we have centuries of this happening that underlies the spread of English around the world. So it wasn't an accident, and it's not globalization, it's colonialism. Now that's an historical fact. It happened in the past, but that doesn't mean it's irrelevant to the present. There are things that can be done to undo the harms of colonialism. So one of the issues I'm interested in is reparations. So the payments to formerly dominated, enslaved, or colonized peoples, right? If you think about the potential for reparations in relation to the English language, then you could think about the British owing millions of dollars to the world for the harm that they have done in oppressing indigenous and minority languages. And I think it's reasonable to have those conversations about what is the concrete material responsibility of the current British government for the harms of previous colonial acts of the British Empire. So that's one thing. The second thing that I would say that we need to look at instead of globalization is the English teaching and learning industry, which is a massive global multi-billion-dollar industry. Because it's a source of profit, it is something that people are invested in protecting and maintaining. So people everywhere are not just learning English because it's a useful language to know. They're learning English because it's a profitable business, and there are multiple companies that are extremely powerful and promote their services around the world to people. And those businesses are often supported by governments. So just to give a concrete example, in Australia, the second largest export industry in Australia is our university education system. So we take international students from around the world, but particularly from Asia. We charge them very high fees to study at our university, and we depend on them knowing English to integrate into our university system. And if they don't know English, we force them to go to commercial language centers and pay until they can produce an adequate qualification that they can study, and then we charge them for the university degree. Right? So like in Australia, we continue to actively exploit the colonial legacies of the British Empire in order to profit off people from other countries in the region. So I think globalization is not the best term to talk about what's going on there, right? We need to think about it in relation to colonialism and capitalism. And then we can start talking about the impacts that it has on indigenous and minority languages, but also more importantly, we can talk about like how to resist and undo those political dynamics, because that's perhaps more important. So then just to kind of like briefly tack on an answer to your question, like English, global English in most of the contexts that I'm familiar with is not the immediate threat to indigenous and minority languages. Typically the threat comes from either a national dominant language or a dominant ethnic or regional language. So for example, in China, where I worked, it's Mandarin Chinese, which is threatening most indigenous languages in the country. It's not English. Or it's the Tibetan language, which is threatening small linguistic minorities within the Tibetan ethnic group. So it's an ethnic language which is threatening them. The role of English in those dynamics is to take resources out of the system, including people's time, and forcing them to study a language that they don't want or need to know very often. So English is a compulsory language across all of China, but most of the country's indigenous languages are not taught in schools and are not used as a medium of instruction in school. If you took English out of that equation, that would free up space to use those other languages. But in order for those languages to be used, you would need like a significant political change in the country to bring about that kind of self-determination and inclusion for those communities. So the problem, English is a problem, but it's not the big problem, I would say. So hopefully that gives you some kind of answer to your question.
Thank you so much for those practical answers, Doc. And now, thank you also for raising your hand, Ms. Manso. Please share your thoughts or ask your questions.
Wait, so am I audible?
Yep, I can hear you.
Thank you, thank you. Anyway, so my question is in the context of language oppression, and as the world is increasingly dominated by global communication networks, does linguistic diversity still hold the same cultural and intellectual value, or has its relevance diminished in favor of dominant global languages? Because where technology facilitates communication across borders and languages alike, such as English, Mandarin, and Spanish, and because because of globalization, efficiency and convenience is becoming more prevalent. So in the sense, is the use or preservation of lesser known languages still seen as something crucial, or is it romanticized into like becoming a nostalgic pursuit of the old identities we have during back in our days?
Yep. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that question. And once again, I'm going to give a slightly unusual answer to that question. So the approach that I advocate, looking at the problem of language oppression, the emphasis is first and foremost on the oppressive relationships rather than the language and their utilities. So if we start out looking at the problem from a utility perspective, we ask questions like, what is the value of the language? Does it have economic benefits? Will it give me a cognitive benefit and improve my brain function? Will it integrate me into national society? Is the language a storehouse of indigenous knowledge and wisdom, etc.? When we start out by asking questions of utility, that very quickly and easily becomes a justification to eliminate languages that are not perceived as having utility. And in situations where you have unequal power relationships, that decision about the utility will always be made by people in power who can basically decide whatever they want. So my concern is that utility justifications for language maintenance and revitalization are always vulnerable to abuse by within the context of power hierarchies. However, if we start off not even thinking about the language and we think about the social and political relationships and focus on the oppression, then the question that we ask is very different. And instead of thinking about the language utility, we ask ourselves, is this oppressive relationship fair and just? Do we want this oppressive relationship to continue? What are the harms and other negative consequences of this oppressive relationship? And I think even when you just start using the word oppression and you start focusing on those questions rather than the languages themselves, the answers are very clear. Like, there's nothing positive about oppression. There's nothing good about oppression. There's no utility in oppression. I don't think it's kind of romantic or naive or nostalgic to say that oppression is bad, right? And in terms of the harms, like some of the other research that I've done is looking at the ways that language oppression is harmful on a physical, biological level in terms of impacting people's health and well-being. And I don't want to go into all of the details of that because that would be a completely separate talk. But the general point that I would make is that, like, language oppression is not only unjust in terms of it being an oppressive relationship, but that it also specifically harms the people who suffer under language oppression. And so the question is it fair for those people to suffer those harms? And the answer is no. Like, a good society is equal and just, and everyone has equal chances, and everyone is equally spared harms and so on. And so when we focus on those political questions, or when we focus on the political dimensions of the issue, we ask different questions and we get very different answers quite quickly. In terms of all those other questions that you asked about the utility of languages, like I would simply just not I would simply just not ask those questions. I would direct attention towards other questions. Yeah. So once again, I have not answered your question, but I hope I've provided some insight that will help you think about the problem in a different way.
Thank you so much, Doc Roche. It really addresses the necessity of creating spaces where all languages can coexist and thrive. We greatly appreciate all your insightful questions. Unfortunately, due to time constraint, we would be able to address all of them today. However, we encourage you to reach out with any remaining inquiries, and we will make sure to follow up you with afterward. Your engagement is highly valued, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. And now we would like to thank Doc Roche for his invaluable insights and for guiding us through such a crucial topic. You know, your words have not only informed us, but also inspired us to think critically about the role of language in our world. As we conclude, I encourage each of you to instill the lessons to heart and consider how we can advocate for linguistic diversity in our communities. Now it's time to hand the spotlight back to our host. Thank you for your participation, and let's continue this important conversation moving forward.
Thank you so much, Sir Jomar and Dr. Roche. As we show our appreciation, we would like to present you with a certificate of recognition. Let me read the citation. Certificate of recognition is hereby given to Dr. Gerald Roche for sharing his time and expertise as resource speaker on the topic language oppression during the second Ilmu International Lecture Series on Applied Linguistics held on November 8, 2024 via Zoom. Once again, thank you, Dr. Roche, for being with us and contributing so profoundly in today's event. Now let's have a special moment to capture today's wonderful gathering. I would like to invite everyone to join us for a virtual photo with our speaker. For a virtual photo opportunity. So please turn on your cameras and get ready to smile as we commemorate this event together. Let's create a snapshot of the incredible connections we've made today. And the count of 3, let's all say applied linguistics. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Applied linguistics. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for being such a great sport.